Welcome everyone to a new tutorial. Today we're going to be doing something completely new. We're going to be painting a mandala and some other designs on a birdhouse. And I decided to do this in kind of a Nordic inspired motif. Be sure that the birdhouses that you're using are very sturdy and also very smooth. It's very hard to paint a mandala on a rough surface. I painted mine with a black multi-surface acrylic all over, front and back, and I let that dry. And then I started marking guidelines. I was making up this design as I was going, so I decided to just fold some paper to try and get some center marks on the birdhouse. And I just sort of folded it and used my General's charcoal white pencil to mark some center marks all the way up the front of the birdhouse and then up across the whole of the birdhouse as well, because I knew I was going to be using the whole as the center of the first mandala. So I added some marks to that to do a clock face, and I'll show you that a little more closer. And then I also needed my center mark for the sides of the birdhouse as well. And I actually ended up dotting the back as well, but I'm just showing you how I did this size. And then I knew I was going to be making a tile design on the roof, so I was trying to decide which size dotting tool to use that so I could overlap the dots. And these are tools from Mark's Mandalas, and I was just holding them up there. I decided to do 8 dots across, and then I would be overlapping those as I went. I'm adding just a few more guidelines. I wanted to make sure I could do a nice little curve on the front of the birdhouse. So I was trying to figure out how to set that in, and I decided just to use my measuring tape to mark a diagonal on each side of that center guideline, and then I would just sort of freehand a curve along that diagonal so I would get a symmetrical look on both sides. And then I just erased the first diagonal line and took it off with a wet Q-tip. And then I wanted to put, excuse me, some curved lines on the side of the birdhouse as well. So I measured up an inch from the floor of the birdhouse and just put a little dot there on both sides. And then I needed something curvy to help me trace that line, and I just decided to use the bottom of my paint bottle. You could use a glass or a little cup. Even a compass is fine. This was just handy. So I just traced the bottom edge of that on both sides of the center guideline to give me a curve. And that was just going to be used as a guideline for a design. And I did it on both sides. So now I have a few marks on there, and I'm going to try and make up a design that is reminiscent of this beautiful Norwegian rose malling. My great-grandmother came from Norway when she was 16 to Ellis Island, and I have loved all of the beautiful art from Norway and have learned to do some of it. But I didn't want to have to use brushes. I wanted to use my dotting tools and try and make something that is similar to rose malling scroll work. So I'm going to mix up some colors. I'm using small airtight containers because it's gonna take a long time to do this tile roof. And I'm mixing up colors that match the rose malling colors. So I'm adding blue, green, tan, and white to get that beautiful Norway blue. It's a very particular shade. And then just mixing up a lighter shade of that same color, just by adding more white this time. And these multi-surface paints actually mix up really well. I didn't have to add any of my Liquitex pouring medium to get these the right consistency, and they didn't bubble up like my other acrylics have done. Now I'm doing the green shades. I want to do a fjord green, so I'm adding yellow and tan and white to my green shade. And I will be listing all of these paint colors in the comments of the video. So mixing up a dark green and a light green of that beautiful fjord green. And now mixing up a goldenrod yellow by adding tan and a little bit of white. The colors in Rose Malling are very vivid, but they're also sort of muted and earthy. So now we've got 2 shades of green, 2 shades of blue, and our goldenrod. And now I'm mixing up this beautiful russet brown by adding a little bit of the tan. And then I'll be adding white to another cup of that to give me a lighter shade. I purchased these little cups at Hobby Lobby. They're just great. They're the perfect size for me. I can fit my tools in them, but they're small enough that I can mix and not get bubbles. And then I just use the red right out of the bottle for the bright red accents to this piece. And I did use some orange later, but I'll show you that. So we're going to start on the mandala that goes around the center hole of the birdhouse. And we'll be starting by just dotting across. So up, down, and then side to side on your little guidelines. And then filling in the dots in between to make a clock face. And then I had enough room to do another row, so I just fit these right in between. I sort of measured it with my tool first to see if they would fit, and I knew they would if I didn't load up the tool too much. And these tools, I am numbering some of them just for those of you who are curious, but just use any tools you have. You just want to make this brown dot here on the next row a slightly larger, and we're going to be doing 8 dots. And now starting to make our petals. This is my smallest dotting tool. This is my Polymer Clay sculpting tool with a fine ball point, and I use this to do my micro dots. And I'm using the yellow paint to walk a very small row around the brown dot, and then flipping my tool over to the slightly larger size to do another row of the light green. And then going for another row of the darker green. Now I'm using a tool to drag a dark blue dot toward the center of the mandala, right in between each of the green petals. And once I've done that all the way around, I'm going to switch to the light blue and just add 2 little swishes on either side of that, just snugging them in there as close as I can. All the way around. And now I'm filling in the space with little yellow micro dots, and then adding 1 more green dot to the end of the petal, just to jazz it up a little bit. Now that the center mandala is done, we're going to start working on the rose malling on the sides. So I started with 2 red dots on my center guideline, and then a large light brown dot, and I'm really loading these with a lot of paint because I know I'm going to be dragging them. So I'm loading them up, making sure there's a lot of paint there to work with. And I'm going to use my ballpoint tool to just drag that down to the red dots. Kind of making something that looks a little bit like a club in a deck of cards. And then I switched to the dark brown paint and just did some swishes right over the top of that wet paint. It's almost like working with chocolate. And then adding a few more swishes to the side. Now I'm going to start walking a blue row on my guideline. starting with a large blue dot and then moving down a size in my tool and walking down that line and then switching to the light blue, continuing to get smaller as I follow the guideline around the curve and bringing those dots all the way down to the edge of the birdhouse. And now I'm going to do the same thing in the green, starting with the dark green with a large dot, moving down a size in the tool, and then switching to the light green as I get to the smaller dots. And then I did a third row starting with the light green with the large dots and then moving to yellow as they became smaller. And then I added 2 small yellow swishes on the sides. Now that the front is done, I'm going to start dotting the sides. And I started with a small green dot and then added a medium yellow dot. And then I'm going to drag a dot around the yellow dot in the bright red, just hugging that as close as I can without touching. And then doing it again, the slightly larger red dot, and it forms kind of a mitten shape. And there's a lot of this shape in rose malling, this mitten shape, and you just keep adding to them to create a floral pattern. So now I'm going to do another mitten in the large brown. So I'm adding 2 large brown dots and then adding another one to the side of that. Again, loading it with a lot of paint because I know I'm going to drag it. And I added some paint to my tool and I'm just going to drag that down and hug the red mittens. I found that this multi-surface paint was really perfect for dragging around on this wood. It was very easy to manipulate. And here's where I added some of this orange. I just mixed up some orange paint and did the swishes in the orange, and then I switched to the yellow and added a couple yellow swishes right over the top of that wet paint. And now we're going to continue with this scroll work flower by switching to the light brown dots, adding 2, really loading them with paint, and then adding another smaller one below. And then we'll be dragging these into mittens as well, and just hugging the previous shoulder and bringing that all the way down to the green dot. And then I decided to add some dark brown swishes to the inside of those. And then switch back to the yellow to add 2 little yellow swishes at the bottom. Now we're going back to the dotted rows again. I decided to do the blue first and switch to the lighter blue as I came around the curve, and then repeated that in green on the inside this time. Bring that all the way up. And then I thought I would add 3 little red cherries at the bottom of this design. Just had enough room to walk up a couple little tiny green stems to the center, and then I added some green little dots at the top here, 3 rows, to complete the edge of that design. And I did that on the other side of the birdhouse as well. And now I'm starting on the roof tiles, starting with the green, going all the way across And then I used a tool just to swirl those to flatten the center of them because I didn't want them drying in a lump. And I used my blow dryer to try and hurry up the drying process, but you really just have to let it sit and dry. You got to be patient with this. And then simply overlapping the next row. So I did dark green, light green, dark blue, light blue, and then just repeated the pattern. Again, swirling those down so they flatten, letting it dry, and then overlapping the next row. And I did half dots on the sides as needed. And just continued that pattern all the way to the top. And it takes a while. You really have to let it dry and just be patient so you can overlap all your rows. But the effect is wonderful. Then I decided to finish the edge of the roof with a row of red dots, and I did this all the way around the roof line and along the edges. And then once again filled in the space with little tiny yellow dots, just like around the center hole of the birdhouse. Went down one side and then came back up the other side. And I did that all the way around the birdhouse. Once everything had dried completely overnight, I used a wet Q-tip to remove any of my remaining guidelines. Get it all nice and clean. And we are finished painting. It was a wonderful challenge to try and design this, and I really like how it turned out. And I decided to put a clear finishing spray on it. I went with a clear polyurethane, a UV coat that wouldn't yellow if I decided to leave this outside for the birds. But for now, I'm keeping it inside the house, and I'm going to give it to my mother. So I did my clear coat, and it's inside, and I think I'll probably do another. I hope you give this a try. Thanks again for watching, everyone. Until next time.